I welcome you now to the study, to the analysis of a book of extraordinary importance. You may have heard the phrase the Thucydides trap, which was made famous by Graham Allison in a book called Destined for War that appeared in 2017, drawing on the analysis in Thucydides to speculate whether the American confrontation with China would ultimately lead to war. Whether one believes in what Professor Allison had to say or not, it's a reminder to us that Thucydides, really from the time it was written in the 5th century BC onwards, has greatly influenced political philosophy and political science. This is a book that you will come back to over and over again. And even in my title of this short lecture, The Birth of Science of History, there's controversy. In your Norton Critical Anthology edition that is the required text for this course, you'll notice a series of essays back and forth about who is the first scientific historian, with some very impressive names of scholars who have argued that it was Herodotus, Thucydides' older predecessor, whom sadly we don't have time to read in this course. I'm going to be arguing that what we get in Thucydides is an analysis of causes, the laws according to which things happen. And obviously you can see that in the way that the Thucydides trap is evoked as a kind of warning, indeed, a real warning to us to avoid the mistakes of the past that we can learn from history. The political scientists in the class will, of course, know about Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, published in 1651. Important to recognize that Thomas Hobbes translated Thucydides in 1628. Another sign of how important this book has been in the shaping of political thought. Although we won't have time in this course to read all of the book, all of the Peloponnesian War, I do hope that you will keep your copies and that you will take the time to read it and reread it. This is a work of extraordinary importance for understanding the way nations interact with one another and the effect of political systems in decision-making. And just a little blast from the past. We've been reading Greek tragedy. You've read Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And in all of those, the Delphic oracle is very important. And I'd been meaning to show you this slide of the exquisite setting of the shrine of Apollo at Delphi. This happens to be a temple of Athena, but as you recall, it was at Delphi that Apollo had his great oracle. And I'm also indulging in a little bit of irony because Thucydides' method of writing history is so antithetical to the use of oracles and any kind of extra rational explanation, really focusing on what it is in human nature and in political systems that causes events. So I thought we should just pause for a moment on the magnificent site of Delphi, which I hope you will visit someday. And here an ancient portrait of Thucydides the historian. And just a few very brief biographical notes. He served as a general in the Peloponnesian War, not very successfully, and was indeed prosecuted and exiled for his failure as a general. Whether fairly or not is a matter of controversy. He himself, as he tells us in the history, suffered from the plague of Athens, the Great Plague in the year 430 BCE, but he did recover, unlike Pericles, the great statesman who died of the plague. And although he clearly lived to the end of the war, as we can tell from the body of the work itself, he did not complete the history. It breaks off in Book 8 in the year 411. And the end of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BCE is narrated in Xenophon's Hellenica. I want to pause for a moment on the self-consciousness of Thucydides as a historian. I've given you two particularly important passages. There are other ones. Right at the beginning, near the very beginning of the first book, he says very clearly, "It will be enough for me if these words of mine are judged useful by those who want to understand the events which happened in the past, and which, hearken this, human nature being what it is, will at some time or other, and in much the same ways, be repeated in the future. My work is not a piece of writing designed to meet the taste of an immediate public, but it was done to last forever. In Greek, it is a ktema saa, a possession for all time." I imagine that you've heard the famous dictum of Professor Santana, professor at Harvard, that those who are ignorant of the past are doomed to repeat it. And what Thucydides is telling us very clearly is he is showing things that are paradigmatic, hence political theory and political science. And later on in the book, when he narrates the terrible events in the revolution at Corcyra, which manifested a level of brutality that even in the ancient world was shocking, he says, "In the various cities these revolutions were the cause of many calamities, as happens and always will happen while human nature is what it is." These are words of warning. These are paradigms that we should study so that we have some sense of what we are getting into and can make rational choices. Now, Collingswood was no lover of Thucydides. He was a great admirer of Herodotus. But this philosopher of history lays down some very important laws that really do converge with the urgency of understanding Thucydides. The historian's goal is knowledge of the present. Think about that. It is not the study of interesting things that happened in the past for amusement. It is an urgent task to help us understand where we are, an attempt to understand the present by reconstructing its determining condition. And most important, what he wrote in 1939 as the Nazi war machine was ramping up for the terrible events of the Second World War. He writes, "We study history in order to see more clearly into the situation in which we are called to act. Hence the plane on which ultimately all problems arise is the plane of real life. That to which they are referred for their solution is history." And Thucydides manifests a meticulousness in method. Look at what he says again very early on in the book. "As to the events of the war, I have not written them down as I heard them from just anybody, nor as I thought they must have occurred, but have consistently described what I myself saw or have been able to learn from others, after going over each event in as much detail as possible. I have found this task to be extremely arduous, since those who were present at these actions gave varying reports on the same event depending on their sympathies and their memories." There's a famous anecdote about Sir Walter Raleigh ripping up a history that he was writing when he found that the eyewitnesses were so very contradictory. And clearly here we see Thucydides wrestling with that same problem. What is good evidence? I need to provide you with a little bit of background of the wars of the 5th century BCE, culminating, of course, with the Peloponnesian War. And for that reason, I want you to take a look at this map. The Peloponnesian War had a theater that went all over the places covered in this map, because it involved not just Athens, which you can see on the map. Let's see if I can help you there. If you look at just about 2/3 of the way down, dead center, you'll see Athens, and right next to it, Piraeus, which is the port of Athens. That'll become very important in the Peloponnesian War. And then if you go into the Peloponnese, the lower part of the peninsula of Greece, you will see Sparta towards the very bottom, kind of center south of the Peloponnese. Those are the two main protagonists of the Peloponnesian War, but because Athens had an empire that it had put together because of its naval dominance, the theater of war spreads all over the Aegean and all the way over to the west coast of Greece as well. So we really are, in terms of Greece, looking at something that is a world war. In order to understand the Peloponnesian War, we need first to look at the Persian wars that led up to it. In 499, going into 493 BCE, the Ionian Greeks, so those are the Greeks on the eastern coast, or I should say rather, you see them on the western coast of Turkey. They revolted against Persia, which dominated them at the time. And in 498, Athens and another city-state, Eretria, go to help their brethren, the Greeks in Ionia, and they burn the great Persian city of Sardis. Well, King Darius is furious and vows revenge. In fact, the story is told in Herodotus that he had a slave who stood by him and would regularly say, "Sire, remember the Athenians." So Darius puts together a huge army and invades the Greek mainland. And in 490 BCE, the Athenians and the Plataeans, their allies, march forth to the plain of Marathon to confront this enormous Greek army. It's a pretty desperate situation. By the best estimates, the Greeks, the Athenians, and the Plataeans are outnumbered about 2.5 to 1. And the Persians really think that the Greeks are going to have the sense to capitulate, to just beg for terms, and certainly not to engage in a battle that they would almost certainly lose. Well, what happens instead? The Athenians and the Plataeans draw up in hoplite formation. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And they advance upon the Persians at a trot. They don't just walk towards them in marching order. They run in marching order against them. And they devastate the Persian army. The Persians lose thousands of soldiers. The Greek casualties numbered 192, all of whom were then declared heroes and given a hero shrine on the plain of Marathon. The story doesn't end there. The son of Darius, Xerxes, comes back with an even bigger army and a fleet, and in 480 BC makes his way down through the Greek peninsula, and there encounters in a narrow passage between the mountains a Spartan army, the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. The Spartans fight in this desperate battle and inflict thousands of casualties until actually a traitor, a Greek, shows the Persians a way around the mountains so that the Spartans are attacked from two sides, and they fight to the last man, including their king, Leonidas. And the monument read, "You passerby, go to the Spartans and tell them that obedient to their laws we lie." And thus the Persian army makes its way down towards Athens. The Athenians evacuate the city. The city is sacked and burned. But Athens had built a great navy. And the agile Athenian ships, their triremes, we'll talk about that in a moment, hem in the larger and more clumsy Persian vessels in the Gulf of Salamis, and they destroy them and slay great number of the Persians who survive drowning. It's an enormous victory, and it's followed up by a land victory at Plataea. And that basically is the last time the Persians attempt an invasion of the Greek peninsula. The Greek alliance destroys the Persian fleet at Mycale in 479, and in 466, at the Battle of Eurymedon, the Athenian navy frees the Ionians and the other cities in Europe, really breaking the back of the Persian war machine. I mentioned the term hoplite, more properly hoplite phalanx. This was an extraordinarily effective military tactic that the Greeks developed, actually seemed to have been strongly influenced by a tactic in the ancient Near East. So much of Greek civilization was indeed influenced and enriched by the ancient Near East. In a hoplite phalanx battle, the soldiers march wearing quite heavy armor, about 50 pounds of bronze, carrying a heavy round shield. And the Greek vase painting here from about the middle of the 7th century is a little bit hard to understand because they're trying to show 3 dimensions on a flat surface. Each of the hoplite soldiers carried this large shield in the left hand with a stabbing spear over the shoulder, and that shield would cover about 2/3 of the soldier's body and 1/3 of the body of the man next to him. It was crucial in a hoplite battle, hence the flute player, to keep in lockstep. The person who jumped out in front of the line saying, "I can take anybody here," or "I'm the greatest warrior," was as dangerous as the coward, because it would break the lines and allow the enemy to start attacking from inside on the sides of the soldiers. And hence the discipline of the hoplite phalanx was to move deliberately, quickly, relentlessly forward. Hence when the Athenians and Plataeans advance at a trot against the Persians, it was of devastating impact. So you'd have rank after rank of soldiers in this lockstep formation. If one man fell, the one behind him would quickly move into position to keep the ranks, to hold the ranks. Anybody who'd been in a hoplite battle, as we learned from the Greek physician Hippocrates, knew that the wounds fell on the throat and on the groin. It took enormous fortitude and courage to engage in hoplite warfare. As Pindar wrote, "War is a sweet thing for those who have never made trial of it. For those who have, it is a thing of terror." And it gives us an insight into the Greek mentality that they were such determined soldiers. This you'll see, of course, or you have seen when you read the funeral oration of Pericles, the sheer courage of the Athenians, willing to face their enemies in this kind of battle. The Spartan hoplites trained relentlessly for war. The Athenians did not turn their city into an armed camp, and yet they were really quite effective on land. And now we move to the naval warfare at which Athens excelled. This is a replica of the ancient trireme, the 3-row, 3 banks of oars that was such an extraordinary innovation. These ships would move very fast. They were very agile. They could do a 180-degree turn in a little over a minute. And this agility and the endless training that the Athenian rowers underwent made them absolutely devastating in the ancient world. This replica was built in 1987, and it enabled scholars to test out whether their understanding of the ancient navy really was correct. And in this relief carving found on the Acropolis in Athens, you can see an ancient carving that shows the three banks of the oars. It must have taken extraordinary strength and training to be able to row, pull these heavy oars that had to be really quite long, especially for the rowers who were at the top bench. Those of you who have rowed crew know that a crew boat does not work if the rowers are not in absolute unison. So you can get a sense of the amount of training that the rowers underwent. And this, of course, had a major effect on the Athenian democracy because the rowers were typically not the wealthy people who could afford hoplite armor, but they were full citizens and they had the same vote in the Athenian assembly and really had a tremendous popular power in the city, popular political power. I wanted you to look at this map. This is before the Peloponnesian War breaks out, just to get a sense of the geographical distribution of the battles that were taking place. There was a lot of fighting between Athens and Sparta even before the outbreak of the Great Peloponnesian War in 431. This gives you a sense of the battles before Sparta and Athens came to blows and during that first outbreak of fighting between the two city-states. I've given you here a brief timeline. After the Persian Wars, after the Battle of Eurymedon, there's an uneasy relationship between Sparta and Athens, although they had been allies in defeating the Persians. Sparta really doesn't like the idea of Athens becoming as powerful as she had, largely through the power of her navy. And so Sparta doesn't want Athens to rebuild the walls that the Persians had destroyed in 480. And it really is a kind of a ruse by which the Athenians just kind of keep their ambassadors talking in Sparta and then finally say to them, from now on, you're going to have to negotiate with us as equals. The Spartan rationale was that an enemy like Persia could then occupy the city of Athens and make it into a stronghold. And so therefore they thought, well, just depend on us Spartans to make sure that everything that you're safe. That was a pretty weak explanation. The the Athenians did not go along with it. Then Sparta had underwent a devastating earthquake in 465, and the Athenians sent a small brigade of soldiers down to help them. And the Athenians and the Spartans just rejected their help, sent them home. And what's sometimes called the First Peloponnesian War erupts in 459 and lasts for 15 years. Finally, there is what was optimistically called the 30 Years' Peace. It did not last because the Peloponnesian War, as we know it, erupts in 431. The lead-up was a dispute between Corcyra on the western coast of Greece and Corinth. And drawn into this was a Corinthian colony, a tribute-paying ally of Athens at the time called Potidea. It's very hard not to see, as you read Thucydides, the role of Corinth, which was a maritime city-state just like Athens, and one that depended heavily on trade. It's very hard not to see Corinth as a major precipitating force in the war between Athens and Sparta. It has a strong self-interest. And so as tensions rise between Corcyra and Corinth, and the Athenians are drawn into the battle, Corinth becomes a real agitator. And this introduces us to one of the major historical controversies. What caused the Peloponnesian War? Well, Thucydides is pretty clear. What made the war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. He's very clear in saying that the truest explanation, but the one that was least spoken of, was this growth of Athenian power and Spartan fear. So starting in 435, Corinth and Corcyra, which had been founded by Corinthians and grown very powerful, it was a great naval city-state on its own, dispute over Epidamnus, which is a colony of Corcyra. Corcyra asks for arbitration over this, and Corinth refuses arbitration, and then they come to a naval battle in which Corcyra defeats a Corinthian fleet, and the Corinthians are furious. So they prepare for war, and Corcyra, which was a neutral state and hence not bound by any of the treaty between Athens and Sparta, asks Athens for help, which legally, by terms of the treaty, Athens can do. And Corcyra does note that it has the second largest fleet in the ancient world, and also adds that Sparta is frightened of you and wants war, which seems to have been, to some degree, true. From what we can gather, there was back and forth in Sparta about whether it was time to try to curtail the power of Athens. And obviously they had fought a war in nobody's distant memory. So Corinthian ambassadors counter that Corcyra should capitulate to them, and note that Corinth had once helped Athens in battles with Aegina and Samos, and so Athens should honor her request. They furthermore object to the Megarian decree. The Athenians had essentially made it illegal for anyone in the city of Megara which excluded the Megarians from all of the ports in the Athenian Empire and from the all the markets within Athens and Athenian territory. That, of course, meant economic disaster for Megara. It was a way that Athens was trying to force her back into submission to her and being a tributary ally. And Megara, if you look at that map, occupies an extremely important position on the very narrow passageway between the Peloponnese and the rest of Greece. So this was strategically a clearly important issue. Athens attempts a defensive alliance with the Corcyrians, saying that she won't engage in hostility with the Corinthians, but would be there to protect her. And that doesn't last very long. At the Battle of Sybota, which was the greatest naval battle that Greece had seen to date, eventually her ships joined battle alongside the Corcyrians. Then Potidaea revolts against Athens, and Sparta pledges to give support to Potidaea. Corinth urges the Spartans to declare war. Athens, in accordance with the treaty that she had with Sparta, offers arbitration, and that is refused. The Corinthians say some quite remarkable things about the Athenians, which you can read. It's another controversy. How close to what actually was said are the speeches of Thucydides? On the side of relatively high accuracy, he's writing for people who would have heard these speeches, and especially those that were given in Athens. On the other hand, clearly there were no stenographers, and he is reconstructing on hearsay or perhaps in some instances things that he himself heard. So what the Corinthians say in Sparta is really quite remarkable. They press their advantage when they are stronger than their enemies and retreat as little as possible in defeat. When they act on behalf of their city, their minds are their own, but they sacrifice their bodies as though they belong to others. And if they fail to achieve their goal, they consider they have lost what already belonged to them. In brief, the truth is that the Athenians were born not to have peace and not to let anybody else have it either. And you will see some of these same virtues of the Athenians praised by Pericles in his funeral oration after the first year of the war. Now, the Athenian response to all this objection to them, to the Spartans, is, "We have done nothing extraordinary, nothing contrary to human nature in accepting an empire when it was offered to us, and then in refusing to give it up." Referring to is that they had led the alliance to stamp out the Persian influence and Persian control of the Greek city-states all over the Mediterranean world, and made them allies, tribute-paying allies, who either had to give ships or money. So to continue, 3 very powerful motives prevent us from doing so: security, honor, and self-interest. It has always been a rule that the weak should be subject to the strong, and besides, we consider that we are worthy of our power. And Athens liked to think of itself as a kind of a soft despotism, one that was fair to its allies, to its tribute-paying allies. That's, of course, an element of perspective. If the tribute wasn't forthcoming, there were Athenian warships to make sure that it did get paid. And the Athenians had the ability to blockade a port and see to it that the city essentially was starved for trade and for incoming goods. I hope you will read this section of Thucydides very carefully, because it is one of the clearest and most eloquent descriptions of the Athenian democracy at its height. Pericles, its great leader, delivers this oration over those who fell in the first year of the war. He starts with gratitude to the ancestors who built Athens to what it is in his time. Pericles recounts how the past generations, through courage and by their own blood and toil, built the empire that Athens has. And he then focuses on what it is that makes Athens so remarkable. What is this great and extraordinary system that they have created? And I want you to recognize that this is something quite unique. We take democracy more or less for granted, that many places have been democracies, but this is the first, and it sets a pattern for so much that is to follow in the history of the world. Our Constitution is called a democracy, demokratia, that's a Greek word, because power is in the hands not of a minority, but of the whole people. When it is a question of settling private disputes, everyone is equal before the law. When it is a question of putting one person before another in positions of public responsibility, what counts is not membership of a particular class, but the actual ability which the man possesses. And quickly after that, Pericles says something absolutely remarkable. We don't get into a state with our next-door neighbor if he enjoys himself in his own way, nor do we give him the kind of dark looks which, though they do no real harm, still do hurt people's feelings. In other words, a respect for privacy, a respect for people's individuality. And he goes on to say, we are free and tolerant in our private lives, but in public affairs we keep to the law. This is because it commands our deep respect. So the ability to be individual, to enjoy their private lives, but on the other hand, to be absolutely committed to the public space, to obeying the law, and to looking out for the well-being of the city-state as a whole. Athens is a place of culture where people enjoy recreation. In our own homes, we find a beauty and a good taste which delight us every day and which drive away our cares. Then the greatness of our city brings it about that all the good things from all over the world flow into us, so that to us it seems just as natural to enjoy foreign goods as our own local products. Remember, this is the time when Sophocles and Euripides are writing. This is a time when the Parthenon is being built. Athens is a place that has really developed a culture that was remarkable, that nothing like it had been seen before. And contrast that with the Spartans, who undergo the most rigorous, unpleasant kind of training all the time to be ready for warfare. Their youth live in barracks under pretty miserable conditions to make them tough. And they were brilliant warriors. Their hoplite phalanx was so organized that even if the ranks were broken, they could quickly reorganize. They were ferocious warriors. But what were their lives like? Nothing like the lives of the Athenians. Pericles is proud of the fact that although the Spartans from their earliest boyhood are submitted to the most laborious training and courage, we pass our lives without all these restrictions and yet are just as ready to face the same dangers as they are. And the Athenians are intensely involved in the governing of their city. And one has to step back and wonder that certainly there were aristocrats, and they were the ones that typically were in the top offices of the city. But everybody in the assembly had the right to speak. And whether you were from the bluest blood of Athens or whether you were a fishmonger or a garlic seller, you had the right in the assembly to speak. And Pericles is very clear about this. We do not say that a man who takes no interest in politics is a man who minds his own business. We say that he is worthless. Hence a level of extraordinary engagement. And the Athenians believe in debate. Good answers come from people sharing ideas and arguing about them in the assembly. Pericles uses a phrase that became very famous. Taking everything together, I declare that our city is an education to Greece. It is the school of Greece. And I declare that, in my opinion, every single one of our citizens, in all the manifold aspects of life, is able to show himself the rightful lord and owner of his own person, and to do this, moreover, with exceptional grace and exceptional versatility. And he ends in praising those who have given their lives for Athens, saying, famous men have the whole earth as their memorial. It is not only the inscriptions on their graves in their own country that mark them out. No, in foreign lands also, not in any visible form, but in people's hearts, their memory abides and grows. Make up your minds that happiness depends on being free, and freedom depends on being courageous. These are deeply inspiring words. This is the voice of Athens at its very height. I don't mean for a moment to be suggesting that there were not dark elements about the city. Its imperialism, as we'll see later in Thucydides, its ability to be absolutely ruthless and brutal in dealing with allies who were not contributing as they should or who revolted against the city. But as a statement of what a free society can achieve, this is an extraordinary moment not just in the history of Greece, but in the history of civilization. You've read enough tragedy to know that the Greek concept was that human life is not a safe or necessarily comfortable existence. It's always subject to great reversals of fate and fortune. And certainly one of the great scholars of the last century, named Cornford, wrote a book called Thucydides' Myth Historicus. In other words, saying that Thucydides combines the elements, the paradigmatic elements of myth with his scientific history. And one senses that in seeing that right after this extraordinary homage to Athens, its greatness, its glory, Thucydides describes the Great Plague. Now, the historian has a number of ways of arranging what he's going to cover, and it's hard not to see that what Thucydides wants us to remember is that there is that element that of the unpredictable, of things that can trip up a person or a city even at its heights. And certainly certain things about the plague were kind of predictable. Many people crowded into the city because with the Spartans camping each season outside the walls of Athens, the country people had no place to go except to pile into the city. And that obviously is a recipe for pestilence. There's very high mortality among the doctors. It was a gruesome illness. Thucydides describes it in some detail because he had it and recovered. Pericles had it and died of it. And what it also brought was a certain moral decay. The plague initiated a more general lawlessness in the city. People dared to indulge in the pleasures they had previously hidden when they saw the swift change from well-being to sudden death. Fear of the gods, the laws of man? No one held back, concluding that as to the gods it made no difference whether you worshipped or not, since they saw that all alike were dying. And as to breaking the law, no one expected to live long enough to go to court and pay his penalty. So all those wonderful words of Pericles about the respect for the law, the great esprit de corps of the Athenian, is falling apart in the pestilence. And Thucydides adds a little barb about those people who wanted to interpret the oracle just to make sure that it matched the actual circumstances. Thucydides takes clearly a much more logical and scientific approach, trying to understand why things happen. I won't read to you the description of the plague, but I thought this engraving based on a painting by Michael Sweerts that's in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, it kind of captures what Thucydides describes: people dying right out in the open, bodies left unattended, the absolute dissipation of all of the communal spirit of the Athenians. I noticed in the Atlantic a meditation on ancient and modern plagues. I actually find there's some issues in the way the author, Catherine Kalaitis, reconstructed Greek history. I think the Athenian democracy was much more resilient than she gives it credit for. But I was intrigued to see the evocation of the plague as described in the second book of Thucydides, in looking at what besets us now, namely with COVID-19. And I do take the warning that we must not be complacent about the possibility that we will be giving up key freedoms, we will be giving up some of our cooperative spirit if we're not careful. I am obviously, just to digress a bit, very glad to see the countries that have been showing such respect for their medical providers, the generosity of companies providing things for them. But it's certainly something that we must always guard against and remember that in times of fright, times of terror, times of privation, that history shows us that people's morals can slip. In the second book, we have a explanation of the Periclean strategy both in the words of Pericles and in the analysis of Thucydides. The Periclean vision was that Athens will prevail by staying inside its walls. And the walls of Athens went all the way from the city down to the Piraeus, the port, so that the Athenians could always have access to the sea. And the Periclean strategy was, no problem if the Spartans want to come and burn our farms and burn our houses and burn our fields. We can get anything we want from anywhere in the ancient world because of our command of the sea. But this was not easy for the people of Athens to look out from the walls and see the devastation of the things that they owned. Moreover, the plague obviously was a sign of just how bad the hygiene and the living conditions were within the crowded city. So by 430, the Athenians are angry at Pericles. They vote him out of office, they fine him, and then they quickly elect him again. Plato saw this as just a sign of how foolish democracies are. On the other hand, I want to step back a little bit and say, what is wrong with the idea of a free people dissatisfied with the leader, voting him out, and then changing its mind and voting him back in? Maybe that's actually a sign of political health. So back to Pericles. As I mentioned, he tells the Athenians not to care if their land is ravaged. He even says, you ought to go out. We should have done it ourselves, just to show them how little we care, how little cathexis we have for our property. We care about people's lives. He warns them, don't add to the empire while the war is in progress. This gets violated by the people who come after him, leading to the disaster in the expedition against Sicily. And Thucydides sums up, Pericles, because of his position, his intelligence, and his known integrity, could respect the liberty of the people and at the same time hold them in check. He doesn't flatter them, he scolds them. He tells them when they're being too fearful. He tells them when their ambition is getting beyond where it should be. This is a sign of leadership rather than simply political antennae, putting a finger up to the wind to see where the popular winds are blowing. And then Thucydides says something really quite remarkable, that nominally it was a democracy, but really was power in the hand of the first citizen. Thucydides has his own skepticism about the democracy. After all, they drove him into exile because of his questionable performance as a general. But again, I want to encourage you to step back and think a little bit about this. A city-state that can elect Pericles, can vote him out of office, can fine him, and will follow him most of the time because they recognize his great ability as a leader. Is this a sign of a dysfunctional democracy, or is it in fact a sign of a healthy democracy? Well, we will continue our exploration of Thucydides in our next lecture, and you will please answer the prompt for this section of Thucydides, and there'll be another one to follow.